the CEO of Pledge. It's a great honor for me to have you all here at Stanford today. I see a lot of familiar faces. I see a lot of some of the new faces. And today we have a great speaker today to come to our Stanford University here at the Faculty Club. For those who don't know DeFi and NFT, I don't need to explain who is buying Mr. Brian Brooks, right? So I don't need much explanation. Just something quick on my side. Mr. Brian Brooks used to be the finance US CEO. He used to work for Coinbase as the chief legal officer, and also a director at FDIC. And let's welcome Brian Brooks here, and let's him take over and talk about the future of DeFi and NFT regulations. Let's welcome Brian Brooks.
Well, Tony, thanks so much for having me. This is fantastic. You know, you really made it in this business when Stanford invites you to speak. I'm spoken to everybody else, but on Stanford invites you to speak, that's big. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about what I consider to be the awkward relationship between DeFi and regulation. And I want to put this in some context and give you some thoughts about what's going on in Washington and in the Basel Committee and kind of globally around DeFi. But I want to put it in context of what I think all of you who work at DeFi is trying to do. Because I think this is something regulators don't think very much about, is the problems that the builders are trying to solve. And so I'm going to try and describe for you why that creates a regulatory trap that makes it very hard for regulators to think about these problems. And the trap that I'll describe for you is what I sort of characterize as the difference between net risk and incremental risk. So without front running that, I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But what I want to begin with is to talk a little bit about the way that, at least in Washington, I don't want to say we because I try and spend as little time as possible in Washington, but I'm going to talk about the way that we in Washington think about regulation. We tend to think about regulation as a binary. Something's either regulated or it isn't regulated. And if you show up in Washington and you're on the side of not being regulated, then you're a Wild West cowboy at best, and you're probably a Bernie Madoff level criminal, in the eyes of many people who are going to see you. But on the other hand, if you're coming to Washington and claiming to want regulation, which is about the extent of the dialogue, you're seen as naive and somebody who can be rolled in some political process. So neither of those outcomes is a good outcome. So I'm going to try and talk about regulation a little bit differently, not as a binary, but as something that is a nuanced process to manage risk, to make sure that we don't have another financial crisis, to make sure that the world doesn't come to an end in some way. That is not the way, however, that most industry participants or people at DC usually talk. So let me begin with a little example of how regulation could work or shouldn't work. It's sort of my favorite example for people who treat regulations as binary. So I think everybody in the room knows, although maybe you don't, some of you are so young, you probably don't know what broadcast television is. Does anybody not know what broadcast television is? Okay. Once upon a time, there was a television set and you would turn the dials and you would watch channel 11, sort of thing. And to be a television broadcaster in the United States anyway, you have to have something called a broadcast television license that's issued to you by the FCC. And it's issued for a good reason, right? Which is that there's only so much spectrum out there. And if you have two people broadcasting on the same spectrum, you just get noise. So without regulation, you would have a giant tragedy at commons where nobody would be able to watch TV. So it's important that I say that only you can broadcast on this many megahertz. You can broadcast on some megahertz. We need regulation for that purpose. And that was the way the world was from the 1930s until the 1990s, right? And then one day in the 2000s, somebody invented a company called YouTube. Now, YouTube is very much like broadcast television. You watch it on a screen, it has content. Unfortunately, sometimes it even has commercials. It's weirdly more like broadcast TV than you want. The question is, should YouTube have to get a broadcast television license? Kind of not an academic question, right? TV broadcasters at first thought that maybe it should have to get a license because it's not fair, right? The broadcasters have to pay all this money and bear all this burden. Why should YouTube be able to distribute on-screen content without the license? Reminds you a little bit of another debate about regulation, the Uber and Lyft debate, right? It's not fair to the taxi medallion owners that Uber and Lyft drivers don't have to spend $1 million to buy a medallion, giving them the right to sell rides in their vehicles. But that's the whole point of what you do at Stanford. The whole point of technology is to solve actual problems, is to reduce costs, to reduce burden, to reduce risk. But the thing you will always confront when thinking about regulation is that the regulators and the competitor incumbents believe that it's not fair that you sidestep the problem and you should be shackled, right, by the same licensing regime that the incumbents have. And so that's where I really want to begin today, is to first talk about what problems is DeFi trying to solve. And it's important that we talk about this because those of you who are founders of DeFi projects will eventually find yourself talking to the securities regulators or the commodities regulators or the banking regulators, all right? And their approach is going to have no knowledge at all of the problems you're trying to solve. They're just going to ask you the binary question, do you want to be regulated or not? So I'm going to try and give you some language to talk about that differently. So let's first of all talk about what problems is DeFi trying to solve. Well, first, I would argue it's trying to solve the problem of artificially low rates. This has been a really big problem since about 2008. I remember a time when I was earning 5% in my money market fund, and now I'm earning 30 basis points, right? Some of you, again, probably don't remember a time when you were 5% in the money market fund, but it wasn't all that long ago. But starting in 2008, and for the entire decade and a half since 2008, the Federal Reserve Board and other central banks around the world have artificially suppressed interest rates as a way of stimulating growth, which is great for some people, right? It's great if you own stocks, but it's really terrible if you're living on your savings. So if you're your grandmother, I don't know when it's their own grandmother, okay? But if you're an elderly person trying to live on your savings on a fixed income, you can't generate very much income in interest rates. One of the problems DeFi tries to solve is to have other ways of generating yield, right? So you've probably heard the old trope, which goes around crypto Twitter all the time, directed at the SEC, please stop protecting me from 4% interest rates, right? But one of the problems you're trying to solve is artificially the rates caused by monetary policy. Another thing that you're trying to solve is the problem of liquidity. So in many financial asset classes, there are only so many counterparties you can deal with because of constraints that are put on those markets. So for example, if you're transacting in commercial mortgage-backed securities, there were really only 8 or 10 investors in commercial mortgage-backed securities because of the way those things are packaged, structured, sold, and they can only be sold to accredited investors and institutions. Hence, there's not nearly enough capital for the building of apartment buildings in the United States. One of the things DeFi is trying to do is to say, wait a minute, all of you are sources of capital. You should be able to buy $1 worth of an apartment building. And once you unlock 7 billion people around the world, there's almost limitless liquidity. That's a problem that you're trying to solve. Another one, the middleman problem, right? The middleman problem. Banks and broker-dealers are crazy expensive. They used to be crazy expensive, by the way, in a transparent way. I hope that's not like an earthquake or a tornado.
Yeah,
It's possible I've been reported missing. I'm not 100% sure. If that's the case, let's keep this quiet. So the middleman problem is a really huge problem. It used to be a huge problem because if you wanted to go trade a stock or a bond, you had to go to Merrill Lynch and pay $250 regardless of the lot size. So if you're going to try and buy 50 shares of Amazon stock, you literally have to pay $250 for the privilege of being able to spend your own money to buy an equity security. That eventually went away, and Charles Schwab came in and made those fees much lower. And then Robinhood came in and made the fees zero. Except they didn't really make the fees zero. Right? They just hid the fees. I mean, they made them lower, but they started transacting in 12b1 fees and payment for order flow. There were always fees, right? Nobody's in this for free, right? Finance is not a helium institution. So there are fees, and DeFi tries to solve that by saying there is no company in the middle of this. There's only a protocol. There's only an algorithm, and that's a pretty important thing to solve. There's the issue of settlement, speed, and certainty. So even today, even in 2021, for many kinds of banking transactions, there's a T+3 settlement timeframe, which means that the transaction can still be rescinded or disputed 72 hours after the time the transaction was initiated. And chargeback risks, especially on international transactions, are enormously high percentages of total transactions. DeFi eliminates that. DeFi offers certainty and instancy. Interoperability is another thing. One of the great things about the stablecoins that power many of the DeFi protocols is that they operate not just on Ethereum, but also on Solana and also on other platforms, which is not something that occurs in traditional finance, right? One of the things I always find crazy is if I'm a Venmo customer and you're a Zelle customer, I can't send you money. How stupid is that? The reason I list all these things for you is because DeFi solves real problems. It solves real risks and real costs in a system that we all participate in. And yet, the regulators are super scared of it, right? Because it's new. And it does introduce some incremental risks. And this gets at that issue I want to talk about net risk versus incremental risk. So DeFi does introduce some new risks. For example, the fact that when I buy a security from Charles Schwab, I know who I'm buying a security from. But when I enter into a DeFi pool, I actually don't know who the counterparty is. I just know that there's a whole bunch of liquidity floating around in the form of tokens. This is one of the reasons that institutions, at least in this country, don't currently participate in DeFi. So if you're an investment advisor or an investment company, you cannot participate in a compound protocol, and you cannot go to BlockFi or 8% interest. You can't do it. And it's because you don't know who the person on the other side of it is. There are one or two other new risks, but that doesn't mean that on net, DeFi protocols are riskier than the banking system or the security system. It just means that there are one or two risks that are new. So if you have a universe of risk and you assign a certain point, okay, to each kind of risk, it might be that DeFi adds 3 points of risk and subtracts 23 points of risk for a net positive of 20 points. This is not the way people think in Washington. We're going to talk more about that. So that's what DeFi is about. Let's talk about the other side of the trade. What do financial regulators care about? What are their main concerns? And the reason I want to articulate this is I want us to do a little overlay and figure out where do the risks that we're solving meet up with the concerns the regulators have. So what are the main concerns of financial regulators? Well, I would argue that there are some official concerns that they would actually admit openly. And then there's some unofficial concerns that they will not openly. So let's go through the official concerns for a moment. There's fraud. Nobody thinks you should be able to sell me something that you're not really selling. You know, you're not going to sell me fool's gold. You're not going to tell me this is a 6-cylinder engine and then give me a 4-cylinder engine. That's a legitimate concern, right? Or if you promise me a certain interest rate, you're not going to charge me a different interest rate. That's just fraud. There's self-dealing. There's the idea that, hey, I'm on the board of this bank, and I'm going to cause the bank to make me a bunch of loans at low interest rates. You know, I'm really not here to be a fiduciary for the bank. I'm here to get my share. So self-dealing is an issue. Human error is an issue. People just make mistakes. You know, think about the London whale trade that JP Morgan a few years ago. That was nobody screwing up or screwing around. They weren't trying to self-deal. They just had a bad risk calculus that made an error that lost the bank $6 billion. The person didn't profit from it, just a mistake, credit allocation mistake. This happens. And so, you know, this is the thing that regulators are concerned about. Discrimination is something that regulators are concerned about. We have a value set in this country that says that people are entitled to be treated equally in the credit system, the housing system, the security system, regardless of race, gender, you know, and a number of other characteristics. So that's an important thing. Taxpayer loss is another thing they care about. This is why we have the FDIC, right? If a bank fails, taxpayers are going to pay that bank's depositors back at great cost. And so the government wants to minimize the number of times that happens because it's expensive. And finally, there's systemic risk. There's a belief that certain institutions are so big that if they were to fail, all of us would be affected, even if we're not the customers or the equity holders of that institution. So those are like the publicly stated main goals of regulation. And if you think about it, most of those goals have to do with one problem. It's the human problem, right? Most of those goals are to mitigate and eliminate greed, graft, and negligence. Basically those things. DeFi, of course, doesn't have any because there's no person. It doesn't have any negligence because it just does what the code says it does. So in the main, you would think, gee, regulators are going to see DeFi as a positive thing because it's taking all of those risks out. But that's only the list of the official concerns. We've actually structured the financial regulatory system with that in mind. So in the United States, if you think about the way the financial regulation works, we have one agency for each type of company. So the agency that I used to lead, the Office of the Comptroller of Currency, regulates banks. So the OCC is super pro-bank. We love banks. And what that means is we kind of hate anything that competes with banks. Okay. Then you have the SEC. The SEC exists to charter and regulate broker-dealers, the Charles Schwabs of the world, the Robinsons of the world. And it turns out that if you're running the agency that charters and supervises broker-dealers, you kind of hate anything that competes with broker-dealers because your job is only important if the broker-dealers are super big and successful, right? Same thing with the CFTC, which runs the derivatives market in the United States and licenses derivatives platforms. I could go through the list, but the point is we have affirmatively set up a system that is all about shoring up the entities that are within that system's control. So I was in charge of JP Morgan. I was really super excited. I really wasn't. That's why I had a problem with JP Morgan. But most people who had my job, they were cheerleaders for banks. And that means that it's a real problem when something comes to peace. That's one of the two unstated, unofficial, yet real answers. And the other is something that anybody who took a Stanford political science class will be familiar with, which is just bureaucratic turf. So, it is a truism of political science that bureaucracies exist to perpetuate and extend themselves. And if you haven't worked in one of these places, you really can't imagine how true that is. It's a constant attempt to expand turf. And you see this in lots and lots of little ways throughout the economy. So if you think about the fact that in 1950, there was something like 4 professions in the United States that required a license, basically doctors, dentists, accountants, and lawyers. Today, 30% of all professions require the government license. Why? And the answer is because the agencies that do the professional licensing have crept and crept and crept because that's what they do, right? In the same way that if you work in a company, you want to grow your field, you want your team to succeed. It's a natural human impulse, but it's really unchecked in the world of the government. And so what it's looking to do is to expand turf and protect its own incumbents. That's what it's looking to do. And that is where DeFi runs into a significant problem, because DeFi is a real challenge, not like it's a little bit cheaper, not like it's a Robinhood competing with Charles Schwab. It's a fundamental challenge to the way that value is transacted in the world, which means that if you're chartering banks, it's a big, big problem, a really big problem. And I'm going to come to that in a moment because we're now at a moment, early in this administration where, the agency heads are being nominated, and you can see from their statements how they're thinking about this. They are very threatened by this, so I'll come to that in a moment. So let me unpack that a little bit more. Let me just talk for a second about what really is behind, in light of these concerns, what is behind government opposition to DeFi? And by the way, I'm not talking a ton about NFTs, in part because NFTs are sort of a species of this, as you know, so you can fit that within it, but I have to take questions later. I'm just going to frame this in DeFi terms. So what's behind government opposition to DeFi? Well, first of all, it's the fact that we have multiple agencies. Okay, so as I say, every agency's got some kind of incumbent that's being, if you want to think about oxes being bored, whose oxes are being bored by what you're all working with. If you're running a decentralized derivatives exchange, that's a real problem with the CFTC. It's going to cause their charters to go away. That's a problem. Then it is what I referred to a little while ago of entity regulation versus activity regulation. So, the OCC, my old agency, it doesn't regulate all credit. Credit's an activity. You can get credit by issuing a bond in the markets, or you can get credit by going to the bank for a loan. But there's no one agency that regulates credit in the United States. My agency just regulates banks, right? And the bond market is regulated by the SEC. So when you have that, that's what gives you the turf competition that I talked about. Then, of course, and this is one of the most interesting things going on right now, there is actually a robust ideological debate going on in the United States over the proper role of the private sector of financial services in general. This may be news to you, but it's one of the most important ideological debates going on today. And in a world of hyperpolarization, both parties have taken sort of the most extreme version of the ideology. So on the Republican side, it's 1890s markets gone wild. But on the other side, there literally are serious voices in the government running federal agencies whose view is that not only should we not have crypto, but we probably shouldn't have privately owned banks. We probably should have the government allocate credit itself. That's the viewpoint of the person who's been nominated to take my job. Is literally that we should probably, to quote her exact words from 6 months ago, we should probably end banking as we know it. Okay. So the ideological debate about DeFi, which is an even more private sector solution to finance than privately owned banks are, because it puts all the power in everybody's hands. It doesn't even let one bank CEO control it. You all control it. That's a threat if you believe that that's an issue. And what I would tell you about this, sort of at the end of all of it, is there's kind of weirdly only one thing that both parties seem to have in common at this point, and that is they all hate banks. That's the funny thing. So if you think about it, it's not even a lifeline, it's literally true. So if you think about the spectrum of the ideological debate that drives regulation in the space that we all care about, you can think about a spectrum like this. You can think about a fully centrally planned financial system run by the Federal Reserve System over here. Okay. Over here, you have what has been the status quo for the last 100 years, which is a system dominated by 10 or 15 mega banks, what we used to call money center banks, which kind of intermediated between people and the government. They were owned by private shareholders, but they were chartered and supervised by the government pursuant to some special privileges that they got. So they were kind of neither fish nor fowl. They sat in between. And then you have a fully decentralized human controlled financial system over here, which is what you're all building if you're in crypto and DeFi. Okay, so government, netherworld of banks, crypto. Only thing everybody agrees on is they hate the banks, which means that we're poised for a really interesting political realignment here right now, because the current system is not likely to persist as it is in 10 more years. So the question is, in 10 more years, will most Americans get all of their financial services directly from the government, which has advantages, but also has real chilling risks that I'll describe? Or will we live in a world where all of us have been empowered and we run our entire financial lives on our phones? That's a legitimate question. And that decision about the outcome is going to be made in probably the next 18 months. So what you're doing is super important, but that's the backdrop for how all this works. So having said that, let me walk you through what I think the most salient issues facing DeFi are today. I'm just going to take through a few of these and have some dialogue about it. You'll probably tell me that some of your projects implicate one or more of these issues. So what are the most salient issues? Well, the first one is securities enforcement. So, many of you, like I do, may have friends who work at Uniswap. Uniswap woke up one day and read the Wall Street Journal. This is actually how you find out nowadays. You literally read at the Wall Street Journal that they were getting what's called a Wells notice from the SEC, which basically means the SEC is saying we're going to be suing you next week unless you convince us not to. And this is a little bit scary. But the SEC is looking to take down one or two big targets in the world of decentralized exchanges to make their point and show the rest of you from building what you're building. And there are a couple of things to know about Uniswap and what it forecasts for the future of decentralized exchanges. So one is the idea that if you think you can satisfy the US regulators by geofencing US customers from your platform, you're probably wrong about that. And honestly, if you even believe that you're effectively geofencing people on your platform, you're probably wrong about that too. So the issue is if you're located in the US, if the code was written in the US, let alone if you have customers using the platform in the US, it's going to be hard to avoid SEC jurisdiction. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is how quickly and through what manner can you achieve decentralization, right? Because the best defense to all of this is that we actually succeed and create truly decentralized protocols. In the case of Uniswap and almost every other protocol out there, they start the way they start, which is there's a team of people who generates a protocol. They mint a bunch of tokens, and then the tokens have to get out into the ecosystem somehow. And the way that initially happens is usually what gets you into trouble. So the question is, how do you either evade that step or power through to a place where you have actually achieved decentralization through governance or token airdrops or earn campaigns or something else? But the point is, SEC enforcement is the riskiest thing. And I like a couple of these token foundation boards where we can talk about it every board meeting. It's how we're getting sued by the SEC. Okay, the next most important thing is CFTC uncertainty. So one of the things missing from the crypto landscape, which has a lot of DeFi activity right now, has to do with derivatives. Mm-hmm. Now, for those of you who were adults through the financial crisis, you'll remember that derivatives basically became a dirty word, right? So that just to even mention derivatives, derivative. Try saying derivative in Hollywood. I mean, that's really Hollywood. It has an unjustly negative reputation, right? The thing about a derivative is it's not a real thing. It's created by financial engineers somewhere. So it's heavily regulated. The CFTC has to license you to do it, okay? We do a terrible job of describing why crypto derivatives would be a good thing. And thus, if you're doing a decentralized derivatives exchange, you're in trouble, right? Because we don't do a good job of describing why it's good. But here's why it's good. Here's the language that you need to go and describe to the regulators why derivatives are good. Derivatives are good for the very reason that they solve the regulators' main critique of crypto. The main critique of crypto is it's too volatile to be used for anything. Bitcoin goes up 14%, down 38% in a single trading afternoon. That's bad. Do you know why Bitcoin is so volatile? Because there really aren't any meaningful Bitcoin derivatives. What derivatives do is they provide many, many more points of price discovery to the market than primary spot trading does. And the more derivatives that are available, the more stable the price becomes, because derivatives become the leading indicator of tomorrow's price movements. One of the most important derivatives is called future, after all. But when you don't have derivatives, because it's a dirty word, what you have ironically is more volatility in the spot market. So we need to have the courage of our convictions to tell those stories. Until we do, the regulatory posture around your decentralized derivatives exchanges is going to be very hostile. And that's what you have today. So the only crypto derivatives allowed in the United States today are Bitcoin futures and Ethereum futures and nothing else. Leverage is more or less unavailable in the United States for a bunch of reasons, mainly because the CFTC hasn't allowed it. And why don't we have derivatives of Solana or Cardano or any of the other large projects that have had 3,000% gains this year? The answer is because it's a deep intellectual answer. Derivatives are a bad word. Again, it's back to where I started, right? Regulation is seen as a binary. It's either regulated or it's not. You're either good or you're bad. When the truth is, you need nuance. And you only get nuance when you're able to explain the problem you're trying to solve. So CFTC uncertainty around derivatives is a big deal. You probably read a lot of the newspaper about stablecoins. And you may be thinking, what do stablecoins have to do with DeFi? Stablecoins themselves are not a DeFi project. But you can't really have scaled and successful DeFi projects without stablecoins, because stablecoins are sort of the internal unit of exchange. I'm going to contribute a bunch of USDC to BlockFi, and I'm earning every percent of USDC, etc. It's sort of the internal unit that allows a crypto economy to exist as a real economy versus just a speculation economy. When I was at the OCC, I tried to say a lot about stablecoins. I tried to talk about banks' powers to custody the reserve assets behind stablecoins. I talked about banks' powers to send and remit stablecoins as payment instruments. I talked about the power of banks to be validator nodes on Ethereum and other networks across which stablecoins transacted. Okay. I said a lot of things about that. But all of a sudden, stablecoins are back in the news in a big way just over the last couple of months. Secretary Yellen has taken a very strong interest in this issue. And stablecoins are being talked about in a very different way now than they were when I was in office. The way they're being talked about now is in terms of their potential systemic risk. They're not being talked about as payment instruments. They're being talked about as super risky. Because remember my point about net risk versus incremental risk. They're new, and thus there is incremental risk, though they may be far less risky on nothing current instruments. We're not focused on that, however. And so now the issue is, should we limit stablecoin issuers to banks? That is a serious proposal that's subject to a bill in Congress. So imagine if Circle had to shut down because only JP Morgan could issue stablecoins. The thing is, if only JP Morgan can issue stablecoins, we don't need stablecoins. We have a banking system in this country, that's not the problem. But anyway, stablecoins and the future of them is a huge issue that we need to grapple with. Which leads me to the flip side of stablecoins that some of us are talking about on the patio, which is central bank digital currencies. There does seem to be a consensus that money should be digitized, although when you hear people watching talk about digitized, they've never actually seen a line of code. But there does seem to be consensus around this, and the reason that there's a consensus is because our biggest geostrategic competitor, China, has issued a CBDC. There is actually now a transacting central bank digital currency. And so the issue is, what is the right response from other countries? Is it to mirror China and say the future is that every country should have a central bank digital currency? Or is it to say, the approach of a country that is governed the way China is might not be the right approach for a more diverse, more democratic market economy, and there's an alternative. So I'm going to suggest that CBDCs and stablecoins are direct alternatives, that it is highly unlikely that both of those two things can exist in an economy at the same time. And what I'm going to go further and say, so here I'm going to get provocative for a moment. As a university campus, so I think am I required to give trigger warnings? Well, anyway, I hear from my kids that I have to give trigger warnings. So this is going to be super provocative. Central bank digital currencies may really not be consistent with democratic values at all. And so what I want to do is I want to just run through with you the three justifications for CBDCs that the leadership of the People's Bank of China has given as they rolled out the ERA token. So here are the three rationales that the PBOC gives. First, there is this idea that the US and China will compete over who is going to be issuing the reserve currency globally. And as you know, since World War II, the dollar has been the reserve currency, not because were the best and the coolest, but because we were the only big economy left standing after the war. And so it makes sense that everything would be denominated in the currency of the country to still have functioning economy. That makes sense. There's no other reason that exists, unfortunately. I mean, our population is a distant third. On a per capita basis, our economy might be bigger, but on a gross basis, it will not be bigger much longer, and may not even be the biggest today. So at some point, the only reason for the US dollar to be the reserve currency would be that either the growth rate is higher or the dollar itself has features that make it a better utility than some other country. China's plan, in part, with the ERB token is to impose requirements. This has literally been written about in a report authored by the Vice Chairman of the People's Bank of China, to require in the future that inbound foreign investment into China will have to be made in ERB tokens. So China obviously is, by some measures today, and will be very shortly, the largest economy in the world, and because it still has a lot of growth in front of it, might be the most attractive inbound investment opportunity in the world. And so if there were a requirement that to invest in that economy, you must permit the investment in ERB, that is a gigantic justification for central banks to dump dollars and acquire ERB tokens, including in the United States, because a lot of people want to make those investments. And that is a huge carrot that will induce people to drop one currency in favor of another currency because of the condition of access to the investment market. That's the first thing. The second thing is, this is sort of the stick side. The second thing is, as you know, we have a global international sanctions regime led by the United States, prosecuted through something called the Bank for International
He has a boner up there.
In which basically all big country banks agree to observe the sanctions that are imposed by vote of the deposit committee. So, for example, if the U.S. Treasury acting through the committee says this Chinese official is sanctioned and may not, participate in banking, or this country, let's say Venezuela or North Korea or some pariah nation, is the subject of sanctions, no countries within the treaty will transact with that country. The thing about the ERB token is it's built on a proprietary blockchain that only permissioned people will be allowed to join. So it's a closed loop that is away from the deposit committee. So all of a sudden the sanctions regime, now I'm not saying the sanctions regime is good, but it is a central tenet of US like national security policy. Suddenly our biggest geopolitical competitor is able to act away from that policy altogether, which hampers our ability to conduct national security. Again, no value judgment about whether we make good sanctions decisions, but our ability to make those decisions is impeded by this. And finally, and the thing that I find most chilling as a civil libertarian, is the statement that once the PBOC's ERB becomes the main unit of account in China, the government, through the central bank, will be able to have visibility into and make decisions about all retail transactions in the country. So just think for a moment. Think for a moment about everything that you've ever bought with cash. Think about every embarrassing or anathema or could just be a pack of cigarettes. 5 years from now, it could be meat. I mean, there are things, right? The social norms change very quickly. And in a big, diverse society like the United States, there are probably some things that I buy that I don't want you to know about. And it might just be my secret cigar that I didn't need anybody to know I smoked yesterday, but I still want to be able to do that. But under the ERB regime, the answer is if the government decides that smoking is a public health problem, I don't know why they wouldn't decide that. They can say, we're not going to process transactions for cigars. Imagine what else they won't process transactions for. So that's a world of a central bank administered payment system, which is what we are discussing. So as I was saying on the patio, the line that I often have about this thing is, when people tell me, but Brian, China has it, they're biggest competitors, so we need it too. Is I always remind people about the 80s when the United States finally won the Cold War. And I say, we did not win the Cold War by out central planning the Soviet Union. We were not better at central planning than the Soviets were. They were the best central planners of their world. We outdid the Soviet Union by unleashing the power of choice and markets. That's how we beat the Soviet Union. And so what we would do, what the Western capitalist democratic approach to competing with China would be to unleash the power of markets through things like stablecoin innovation, right? And digitization and decentralization, which is what you're all working on. But again, as I said, we are in the middle of a political debate that will be decided in the next 18 months about whether we're going to go down that path or the other path. And that's a really important thing. So that's a CBDC issue. Last thing I want to say in terms of big issues going on today, and then I'm going to wrap up with just a couple of closing observations, is around bank powers and bank charters. Now, this obviously is an issue of great sort of importance to me, because this is about whatever legacy I might have had. So for those of you who don't know, what I tried to work on during my brief government stint, one of the things I did is I granted the first crypto bank charters. There had never been a bank charter granted to a crypto company before. I granted 3 of them. We also released all this guidance that I just talked about stablecoins, about validator nodes in the banking system, and other things like that. All because of a thesis that we had, which is that decentralization is an inevitable state of economic evolution. So in the same way that decentralization came to information exchange, in the same way that it came to commerce, it will inevitably come to financial services. We cannot want it to, but it will. King Canute was not able actually to hold back that tide. And so we try to provide clear rails and clear signals for how that can be risk managed, how we manage that transition to a decentralized future. It is not at all clear that any of that legacy will survive the next 6 months. And again, it's not a political statement. There are 2 different ideological viewpoints about all of this. The person who's been nominated to succeed me has expressed fairly strong criticism of crypto as a general activity. And it's because there's a chorus of decentralization over here and a chorus of central planning over here. And some people legitimately believe central planning is a better thing. You should decide for yourself. But the survival of legal bank participation in crypto is going to be decided in a fairly short amount of time. And to the extent that you won't care about those things because you work in the field, it's a good time to make your views known to your members of Congress, is what I would tell you. So let me just close by saying, I think there might be a better way of thinking about DeFi and DeFi the regulatory environment than the path that we've talked about. I think there are just 3 or 4 things that we might keep in mind for this. So one is, as I've suggested many times so far, we need to take a net risk, not an incremental risk approach to regulation. It seems super simple, but heuristics are a funny thing. And anybody here who studied behavioral economics or is familiar with the work of Kahneman, first year, whatever, is familiar with the concept of status quo bias, which basically says that whatever you grew up knowing, you regard as the state of nature, you regard it as risk-free. You got in your car and you came over here, not thinking for a second there was any risk in it, because you do it every day and you've written that risk down to 0. But you add one new thing, and it's super risky because it's a risk you're not familiar with, right? Except maybe it actually takes some of the risk out of driving cars. Maybe on net it is less risky in the ways that I've suggested DeFi is. But if we don't take that approach, generally what we will do is we will preserve all of the elements of the old system, and we'll have a very hard time adding any new elements, because it's very hard to add any innovation that doesn't have some risk in it. So when you talk to your regulators, when you talk to your mentors and your members of Congress, you need to talk first about the problems you're solving, right? I'm adding 3 points of risk, but taking away 23 points of risk. You need to speak in this language. Second, I believe, and I've written about this pretty extensively, I believe that we need to think about chartering software, not just chartering groups of people. So if you think about what a corporation is, let alone what a bank is, let alone what a broker-dealer is, historically, if you go all the way back to the South Sea Company, and the East India Company, when corporate entities were first being formed in England, to be a corporation, you had to be a group of natural persons. You and I had to get together and sign articles of association. We had to have a board. That's what a company is. If you weren't a company, you couldn't have a charter. The thing is, we're now in a world where algorithms are doing much of the work of corporations. And since we're such a binary species and such a binary body politic, the conversation right now is, well, geez, that thing doesn't have a charter, so it shouldn't be allowed to allocate credit. Well, why not? It's like saying that email shouldn't be allowed to be sent across the internet without postage because, it's not a letter. These are silly ways of thinking, but it is actually the way that regulators think. My argument is, all a charter is a grant of powers to do certain things and an agreement that, to the extent risks are being posed, the government will look at the risks. Why can't we just charter the Maker protocol? I don't mean the guys of the Maker, DAO company. I mean the protocol. It's engaging in credit allocation and stablecoin issuance and a whole bunch of other things. And if it had a charter, there'd be no question about its legality. But without the charter, there's a big question about its legality. And finally, as I've suggested earlier as well, we need to focus more on activity and risk regulation, less on entity regulation. We should not care that this lender's a bank and this lender's not a bank. They're both lenders. They're both doing the exact same function in society. They're drawing capital from the same sources. They are presenting the very same risks, and yet the bank is subject to one set of rules, and this other thing is not subject to those set of rules. This is why I was a strong advocate for payments charters, fintech charters, because they're doing the same thing. And yet, the amount of attack that I got for suggesting that they could possibly be treated the same way was crazy. So I would just suggest these are common sense ways of thinking about things. I think the future of our industry and everything you're working on hangs in the balance. I'd love to take questions. We'd love to kind of help shepherd you through some of these things. So thanks for having me.
Impressive, right? What do you guys think?
It's
Excellent.
impressive.
Okay, so we have time only for 2 questions because we have a very busy night tonight. We have Dr. David Tse here and Nicole here will be speaking next. So 2 questions. Okay,
Let
Chang,
me ask a question. I think it's fascinating, Brian. Thanks so much. And you shouldn't leave Washington because Washington needs someone like you to fix the problems that they're having. To be honest.
Exactly.
Anyways, my 2 questions are related to this, and I know there's other people want to ask a question. As an investor and also an entrepreneur, the first question is: it seems like China is actually ahead of us in terms of digital, sort of this digital competition, if you will. What should U.S. do in terms of catching up? That's the first part of the question. Second question is, we actually, as an investor in Pledge, full transparency there, how could, projects as Pledge work with banking institutions in general? Just DeFi projects work with banking institutions. So what's your recommendations?
Yeah, those are great questions. So both could be much longer conversation. But what I would say is the U.S. has lost its appetite for risk taking. So the weird difference between China and the U.S. right now, I think, is there's sort of polar opposites of each other. So in China, risk is allowed to be taken, but the reward is not allowed to be captured. Right? That's kind of the Jack Ma phenomenon. So when you become too successful, the government shows up and nationalizes your government. But there's a ton of innovation, and I mean, you all know this. Right? But people used to believe that China was all about, everything China did was about stealing intellectual property and incrementally building up, which probably was true 25 years ago, but it's really not true today. Right? A lot of risk taking, less upside capture. Right? In the U.S., we have largely lost our appetite for risk taking. Okay, risk is good. Managed risk is good. Letting risks that materialize result fair, that's also good. But we became who we are because of creative destruction. We allowed people to invest in projects and do things, and we let them be valuable for a while and go bankrupt later, and we didn't force anybody to go to jail because their company failed. That's the biggest thing there. In terms of the issue of you just restate the second part. I want to make sure I get it
Right. So how could projects such as
I got it. So here's the thing. You want to think about banks as distribution. Okay, you should not think about banks as competitors. What I said to the banks when I was at the OCC was, look, the future for banks in this world is the citadel is going away, the moat is going away. I mean, we look at the post office. I mean, JP Morgan is the post office. We just don't send letters anymore. There will come a time nobody writes checks, and already nobody writes checks, but we don't need the aggregation function that banks play. What banks do have, though, is they're super effective distribution. They have customers, they're trusted, they have advice. And so the way I would think about these things is, in the same way that fintechs have been partnered with banks for 10 years, you want to think about banks as distribution. Imagine having a robo-advisor in which Pledge was, like the engine behind it, and the robo-advisor sat on top of Charles Schwab. Those are the real ideas, because you guys aren't good at building customer-facing, I mean, a handful of people are, but generally great at building engines, tech. But the customer acquisition tool that requires scale, you don't need to build that. Go partner with these guys to be your distribution.
That's great. I'm sorry. I think we are running a little bit late on the schedule on the agenda. How long are you staying in this approach? I think everybody wants to talk to you.
Well, I'd love to talk to people. I'm unfortunately only here for another 30 minutes or 35 minutes.
Great.
I'm happy to be on the sidelines. Link in with me, connect with me. I'm happy to check.
LinkedIn, Twitter. Yeah. Okay. So finally, we want to say thank you for Mr. We'll come back to the question. Okay. Big applause for. And thank you for coming over. I appreciate it. Thank you. Great job. Thank you. Thanks a lot. So next speaker, we have my professor, Dr. David Tse, on the stage. I have David. Can you come in? So we have Miss.
That's one.
And not hold on to it.
Yeah.
Should I just talk?
Yeah.
Or
It's recorded.
just record it?
It's streaming, right? We have over 100 people outside
Yes, streaming.
outside this room watching us.
Let's stop it over here, huh?
So I just want to make a quick intro. Dr. David Tse is my professor. I have a blockchain class from him, EE 374. He's one of my favorite professors teaching consensus, and he has been a great supporter for Pledge. And today, Dr. Tse will be talking about. We just tested it, right?
Yeah, we did. This is Murphy's law. Yeah, I think it's on, right?
We'll be talking about building the next generation of blockchain.
Cool.
All right.
Okay.
Are we ready? Almost.
All right. Thanks a lot, Tony. So I met Tony in my class. Is this mic working?
Yeah.
Are people hearing me clearly? Okay. So I met Tony in my class. And the reason why I remember him is every day at the beginning of the class, he would ask me, Professor, how many Bitcoins have you bought today? And you know, I teach the technology of blockchain. You know, I don't go and buy Bitcoins every day, but that's how I remember him. And okay, good. So Tony asked me to talk, just a totally different talk from last talk, is on the technology of blockchain. So our lab is doing research on the core consensus problem. So here's a core consensus problem in a blockchain. That's the problem that all these blockchain platforms try to solve. Is you have a bunch of distributed nodes. Different nodes have different input transactions, and the goal is to come to a common ledger, which is an ordering of these transactions. Okay, so that sounds like a kind of a trivial problem. What's the difficult one? This problem? Why there's so many technologies trying to solve this problem? The difficulty, or one big difficulty, is that there are adversaries for economic or other reasons to try to attack your blockchain, to try to disrupt this agreement that is so important, blockchain. And so basically you can think of blockchain technology is really trying to solve the problem of dealing with all kinds of attacks. So the problem is that the attack vectors, so to speak, are infinite. There are all possible attacks on this blockchain. So to design secure blockchain is extremely difficult problem. But we made a lot of progress in the past few years. However, there are still some fundamental problems left unsolved. And today, I want to talk about two of them, okay? So I want to talk about two classes of attacks on blockchain, and they are unsolved with current platform. And we're working hard on providing solutions to protocols that address these two types of attacks. So today, for time limitation and also lateness of the day, I decided to focus more on the problems and just sketch out at a very high level of solutions and not really go into detail about how the protocols work. So I hear people nodding, good idea. Good idea. Okay, very good. All right, so the two types of attacks I'm going to talk about is kind of total opposite, just to give you a contrast of kind of the space of all possible attack vectors. So the first type I call short-range reorg attacks. Okay, you have heard of a term called time bandits. This is a false to that class. Okay, so these are attacks that tries to accomplish front running in blockchain. The second type of attack is long-range attack, and they try to do a very long-range history revision on your blockchain to solve confusion as to what really is the history. So the entire premise of blockchain is to maintain this one history that everyone agrees upon. And if you can solve confusion on the history, that's bad news. Bad news for the project, for the platform. And so the first type of attacks emerged recently was the rise of DeFi, reached prominence in the past year, within 12 months. This second type of attack is a problem that is known in proof of stake protocol since the beginning, actually. But I claim that this problem has never really been solved. And recently we have a solution for that. Okay, so first let me talk about the front-running attack. So since this is a DeFi summit, I notice that all your meetings are summits. Very good. All right. So what about the valleys? Are there any valleys?
No valley.
No valley, just summits. Every summit is higher than the next summit.
Yeah, look at the map.
Sorry, every summit is higher than the previous summit.
You're already in the silicon.
Sorry?
You're already in the silicon.
You're already in the valley. We don't have to talk about valleys. Good, all right. So everyone knows this curve, DeFi, the rise of DeFi. And that's kind of like a new thing that sort of emerged the past, I would say 12 months, year and a half. That was in some sense after a lot of these platforms get designed. So it turns out that because of that, leads to a whole new class of attack problems, security problems. And let me say a few words about this front-running problem. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with it already. After all, it's a DeFi crowd, but let me make sure everyone on the same page. So we have an honest trader who wants to buy 1,000 shares. There's an order. Unfortunately, the blockchain, everyone knows what's going on. All these transactions are floating around. And some of them even get into blocks. And an adversary observed this trade. They said, hey, wait a minute, there's a big demand for these shares. Let me execute a transaction by disrupting the ordering of the blockchain to put in my transaction first before the honest transaction, so that I can then sell him my shares at a high price because I know there's a demand for it already. So this is the front-running attack. Of course, there are many variations of this, but the idea is that ordering is important. Now, you think about the blockchain, the original formulation of the problem is that we want to come up with a agreed upon ordering, but it did not say which ordering. And this front-running problem is to try to find an ordering that's favorable to that attack. Okay, so that's why this is kind of a new class of attack, because it's not really captured in the traditional formulation of the consensus problem. And this is another term for this is miner extractable value. So the miners do this attack and try to extract value through this front-running process. And on Ethereum, huge amount of MEV extracted. Okay, so that's been a big problem, even got into mainstream media. And so how does it work? Okay, so how does it work? So turns out it's a bit more subtle because there are kind of two, one can think of the two types of reorg attacks. So these are called reorg attacks. So here's the Ethereum blockchain. Okay, this is the public blockchain running very nicely. Suddenly, the attacker saw a viable transaction on the tip of the blockchain. Okay, mines may be used by buying some extra hash power. 2 blocks, release it, and now that becomes the longest chain. And according to protocol, this block disappears. So its transactions now gotten ahead of the transaction in the block, original in the block. So this is the reorg attack. And really the problem here comes from the fact that in the Ethereum protocol, each block is not really very stable. When they get in, there's a certain probability that you can kick it out. And that's the instability of the Ethereum chain. This is one type of attack. But it turns out that even without reorging the blockchain, the blocks, you can reorder the transactions within the blockchain. The problem in Ethereum, or in a lot of blockchains like Bitcoin, the ordering of the transaction is actually controlled by the miner. The miner decides the order. So therefore, it has a very unilateral dictatorial control over the ordering because no one else can affect ordering. And if it got its block in, then it controls the order. So even within a block, you can reorder the transaction without reorganizing any block. So this is posing a lot of problems. And Ethereum has a project called 2.0. It's already out. And there's a merge to replace Ethereum 1.0 coming up in the next few months, Ethereum 2.0. And we studied this protocol quite carefully. And it was meant to design so that you have more stability because you have a lot of validators voting at the same time. So you can see in this picture, many people voting at the same time as opposed to that lonely blockchain where there's only one miner putting the block in. So the hope is to have more stability, less reorg. Unfortunately, we found out last year in a paper that we wrote that no, not only is it reorg attackable, but even worse is you can cause it to flip-flop across two chains forever. So not only asked us to confirm that there are other people also finding other types of attacks as well on the Ethereum 2.0 beacon chain. This is a beacon chain. So that's the problem. And it turns out one of the reasons why is because Ethereum is a very ambitious project. They try to design everything from scratch. This protocol they've been working on for 5 years. They ignore sort of the history of all other protocols and just say, let's start design from scratch. It didn't work. So now we're working with them to try to fix this protocol. But I'm going to propose later on a sort of a better approach to this protocol. Okay, so let's talk the story here. Any question about reorg attacks? Yeah.
So specifically, so it sounds like there are clear issues with Ethereum 2.0, but they are still planning to.
Don't worry, there are 4 months left to merge.
Okay.
4 months is enough. We're smart people. I don't know. I mean, we're working with that. We try our best, but we don't have any stake, So, all right.
I don't know. Can you elaborate on what you mean by reordering on one's blockchains? Because you said you can do it like between chains, not just.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go back to this picture, right? You have one chain, okay? And this reorg attack on Ethereum 2.0 is that you're building a chain in parallel, okay? So now you have 2 chains running. And the Ethereum is no longer based on the longest chain, it's based on some other way, some other so-called fork choice rule on the canonical chain. And the attacker can do it such a way that the canonical chain flip from one chain to another chain. So some blocks appears and then disappear, and then maybe appear again. So it's a lot of problems, a lot of instability. So you never know sort of where you are.
So you're saying it's like the same blockchain. It's all the Ethereum.
Yeah, it's a no.
Right.
Sorry.
But
Yeah.
it's just like the last.
Yeah. So the blockchain is a platform. Yeah. Blockchain is a platform, but there's a chain.
Right.
So unfortunately, this is blockchain. The word chain is overused many times. The chain is called a canonical chain. That defines the ledger. And the goal of a consensus protocol is to have everybody agrees on a unique chain. Let's call it chain, not blockchain.
Okay.
Okay, good. All right. Yeah.
So I think one thing with the reorg attack is because of there is no finality, instant finality.
That's right.
So you have to wait for like multiple blocks in order to.
Yes, that's right. That's right. So
if
no
you have
finality.
a very short time to finalize.
Yes.
Every block you won't have the problem.
Yes. So finality solves half of the problem. Because that's why I mentioned this reorg attack, right? There are 2 types of reorg attack. There is the block reorganization, which can be solved by finality. So you have an instant finality protocol, then you can solve this, you won't have this problem. However, you still worry about whether or not the leader can control the transaction. And in many of these existing finality-based protocols, the leader can still completely dictatorial control. So this problem is awesome. And Ethereum does not solve this problem at all. Even the first problem, reorg has some issues. Okay? All right. Okay, so this is the first class of attack. Let me now move on to the second class. I really admire Brian to be able to talk without any slides. It's just like a different league. I feel to use slides. Okay. All right, so the second type of attack is history revision attack. Okay, so this attack, some people may have known already, but let me go through it because although this attack has been around for a while, somehow it's not solved. So that's what the point I want to say. So let's see what this attack is like. Okay. So this attack is specific to proof of stake protocol. Okay, proof of stake protocol. So in proof of stake protocol, you have a pool of stakers or validators owning stake in the protocol. Okay. And if you put in a deposit, if you're a stakeholder, you put in a deposit, okay, then you get to control how the consensus runs going forward. You have some control, more control. So the protocol runs, okay, and the blockchain grows, the chain grows, the chain grows. And then at some point, you withdraw a deposit and move on to some other platform. So the heart of the proof of stake protocol is that capital can flow in and they can flow out. Stake can change hands. If stake cannot change hands, this is not a proof of stake protocol. It's called permission protocol. That's the old-fashioned way. Okay? All right, so good. So the blockchain continues to grow. Okay? All right, now what happens? Okay? There's actually a time bomb onto this blockchain. And the reason is as follows. After people withdrew, the keys owners have left the system. They have no stake anymore in the blockchain. Okay. However, their old keys that they had when they were in the system is actually very valuable. Very valuable. Okay. So if someone can go and persuade and collect all these old keys from people who have withdrawn from the blockchain, then they can mount the following attack. Okay, so they can build a parallel blockchain, but from the time when the stakes are active in the system. Because from the system's point of view, they don't care whether it's old stake or new stake. There's no notion of old stake because the time, there's no absolute time in a proof of stake blockchain. Time is only defined by the height on the blockchain. So therefore, the deposit here can be used again to build another chain. Okay. And so an attacker could now create an alternative version of history the way they like. Okay? So you say, wait a minute. This is a bit strange because actually Ethereum would tell you, no, you can't do this. And the reason is because if you look at these two blocks, to be able to create this chain, then there must be many people double signing. In other words, they're using the same stake and signing on this block and this block to create this split world, okay, in a proof of stake network. So proof of stake network, each block is kind of finalized by many people signing, many stakeholders signing. So therefore, you can immediately detect that they're double signing, and the Ethereum solution and other projects, some other projects, will try to slash these people to say, okay, your deposit, I have to remove from you. And so therefore, it will be very painful because of slashing for the adversary minus attack. However, slashing cannot solve the problem because in this alternate chain, in the alternate universe, the stakeholder can also withdraw itself. So by the time this chain shows up, no slashing can happen because it's already gone. So now we have two split views, both of which the stakeholders have left. But in the aftermath, they create this split universe. That's bad news for the blockchain. Because one has to try to figure out, okay, you're a client trying to transact. Which one should I follow? Now, if you were in the system forever and observed every single bit of history, then you know, okay, this guy's the first chain, this is the second. But that's not how blockchain works, because blockchain should be able to accommodate clients who join anytime they want, not that they have to be there from day one of Ethereum, which is 201, the merge is happening in a few months, so you have to be there right at the beginning of the merge. That's not possible. So now you're confused. And confusion is really bad for blockchain because the whole point of blockchain is to have consensus. So this is a real significant problem. And many projects are aware of this problem. They're aware of this problem. But it's well known. Vitalik had a very nice post on this problem in 2014. 2014. Okay. So the proposed solutions, okay, are multiple. Okay. So projects like Algorand, crypto, Cardano, very crypto-based project, use crypto techniques. So they have this idea called key evolving signature. That means when you sign something, your keys evolve automatically. So that means the protocol sort of forces you to forget your old keys. Right? Forget your old keys so that you can't lose the keys and manage the account. Okay, however, this is not necessarily incentive compatible. Because why should I be forgetting my old keys? This information, maybe I should just store somewhere. And then who knows, maybe in the future will be useful. So therefore, it's not necessarily incentive compatible. So that's a big drawback of this solution. The second one is actually to try to put back an arrow of time. Arrow of time. Okay. So the point is, the problem of this blockchain is that there is no arrow of time. It just shows up immediately, the second chain. You don't need time to build this chain. Now notice that you can't really do this attack very easily in Bitcoin, for example. Because to create this chain, you have to do a lot of work. It takes a lot of time and money. So for example, to build a chain of this over 1 day, 24 hours, that would cost you about $30 million today's hash rate. Okay, $30 million to build this chain for 1 day. So it's very hard to do it in a like proof of work system. But proof of stake do not want to do the work. They're lazy and environmentally greedy. So to not do the work and simulate this time, pass of time, is extremely difficult. And there's a crypto technology called VDF, verifiable delay function, which does this. Okay, it's a cheap way of simulating time. Solana, for example, uses a form of VDF. Okay. Unfortunately, VDF does not like work because, let me just finish. Maybe I finish this and answer your questions about that. Because I'm like
Maybe if you kind of like a proof of work.
no, it's not proof of, it's proof of time. It's proof of time. There's no work. There's very low computational power. Because of that, basically you're forcing yourself to do sequential work. You have to do sequential work. You do one after another. You cannot parallelize work. Unfortunately, there are often VDF competitions, and people always find that there are other VDFs that are faster than yours. So you build a VDF, and then within the next 2 months, they're faster than yours. And also there may be some faster VDFs too in other labs that you don't know of. So therefore, it's a very, very fragile way. The third way is the Ethereum way. So Ethereum, Vitalik proposed the following idea. He said, we can't really solve this problem, but using only the protocol. So we talk about, Brian talking about the protocol. But Vitalik said, we can't do it. Let's have a cop-out solution. The cop-out solution is that we will have a bunch of people on the Telegram channel. Every now and then, maybe once every week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, we talk together and say, tell people to all the clients, broadcast to all the clients and say, okay, guys, this is the checkpoint, and don't believe any other chain other than this chain. Okay? Frankly, I do not think this is a very satisfactory solution. Okay? Also, you can't do this like every day, you know? Think about the London 1559 event. That took a lot of coordination to make sure all the clients are updated at the same time. Otherwise, we may have a hard call. Okay, so these kind of events are very hard to happen. And so, therefore, you have to have a very long time frame. Maybe every month, you do a checkpoint, every year or every 6 months. But that means that your asset has to be locked up for that long time. Because otherwise, you will be withdrawing very fast. And this checkpointing is coming up too infrequently to stop this kind of attack. So, poor liquidity. Okay? All right. So, All right, so given these two attacks, the reorg attack short term, long range attack, we say, okay, how do we build a protocol that can solve these two attacks? And while solving these two attacks, do not open the door to other attacks. That's the more important thing. Because it turns out you can always design a protocol to stop one attack, tailored to that attack. But then the doors are open to other attacks. That's very common. Okay, so our approach is this, right? We want instant finality. So instead of designing from scratch, let's start with an existing DFT protocol with instant finality already, like Tenement. Very nice protocol. Or hot stuff used in Libra project. Fine protocol. Someone that the community agrees on is a good protocol. And instead of starting from scratch, we start with this protocol, and instead we built sort of a merger on top of this, which enables us to accomplish so-called fair ordering, which is that the transactions ordering cannot be messed up by a dictator, by individual proposals. Okay? And thirdly, we solve the long-range security by extracting security from the most secure blockchain, Bitcoin. So this is what we call Bitcoin-grade long-range security. So as a result, we were able to accomplish security at all ranges. So at the long range, you can get Bitcoin level protection. So to do history revision is as hard as revising a long reorg on Bitcoin. Second, because we have instant finality, block reorgs, short range block reorg is impossible. And thirdly, using our fair ordering module, we protect against transaction reorg. So that's what we accomplished. No time to tell you the details of the technology, but if you're interested, and you come up with a reason, then I'm happy to talk to you about the technology. Thank you.
Now, right? We attend a lecture from Stanford professor. How do you like being a Stanford student? Great so far? Great. We need to do the ID. Yeah. So Dr. Tse will be around. We can talk with him more later. And we have our final speaker, Nicole Chang. After Nicole, quick speech, and we will start our buffet dinner and networking. Okay? That's good. Thank you again, Dr. David Tse. Appreciate it. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks. So now we have Nicole. So Nicole is a super lady. Have you guys check out her LinkedIn profile, find out her background? Just some quick summary for those who haven't know about her background. Nicole is Harvard econ major, undergrad, Stanford GSP and JD. Nicole also was work at LVMH, the DFS shop. Have you heard of the DFS shop? Duty free shop. Nicole was the global VP for business development. The DFS shop was part of the LVMH group. So Nicole specialized in getting many of these world luxury brands into NFT, and she has some great discovery. Also, I know Nicole since 2006 in Beijing, China. She's a great mom right now with 2 kids, one going to Harvard and one going to Stanford.
She still can't get this thing. Is it F9?
Hey, Dr. Tse, I think we need your help. How did you get the computer to work on the slide?
Just plug it in. That's all I did. Plug it in.
Leo is a tech guy, so we'll have Leo candidates. Then Nicole flew in this morning from Pasadena to give the talk. And where are you living, Nicole?
Tomorrow morning.
Tomorrow morning, yeah, coming to talk to us. So she see an opportunity where a lot of these luxury brand is getting into NFTs, and she'll be explaining why people will do it.
Contact close line, maybe you can add to touch. Yeah, we could borrow your.
Yeah, there's one.
Yeah.
Sure. Hopefully you have no parts.
So now we know Stanford GSD and JD couldn't get the slides up. We did a professor, Stanford professor.
It works.
Why don't you open your computer?
Once I open my.
I know, just being near you.
Nicole also is,
Beside you.
yeah, Nicole also is was the president of Stanford GSD Alumni Association. Yeah, so let's welcome Nicole for the speech.
No.
Nice picture.
Yeah. And goals.
Oh, what is it? Let's see.
There you go.
Okay, now, okay. So. I have here this big dog here, and it's rehearsal of a ballet on stage. And as you can see, it's original and it's worth over $5 million. And I took a photocopy of it here. And I think that it's a pretty good photocopy. You can enjoy it quite well. But unfortunately, this is only worth probably the paper it's printed on. But I often ask myself, why is that? Because I can get a lot of enjoyment from this as well. And then you say, well, because it's not the same, actually. You know, you're missing all the fine brush strokes of the paint, and you don't see the beautiful quality of the paper. And then I said, but then you haven't seen this. And this is my red noir. And this is another beauty here, worth in millions. But I have here a copy, which is only worth a few $1,000s. But why is it that you would probably enjoy being with my original and not with the copy? And then tonight I'll be speaking about NFTs, and I asked you, well, here I know you're going to tell me that the oils, the strokes of the paintbrush are not the same, and it's maybe of a different year, so that's why you don't enjoy it as much. What if I tell you I'm going to share some other art with you that is an exact copy? Because with digital art, you can make a copy that's really quite similar, it's not the same as the original. But why is it that one of them will be worth in the tens of millions and the other will be worth nothing? So what is it about it that people like to spend their money, if you will, on the original of that? And I was actually one of the advisors to Bernard Arnault. We worked on a lot of the brands at LVMH. And that was the question we had. What would it take to get people to want to spend money, if you will, on something that they believe enhances their lives? So to begin this discussion tonight, I'll be talking about the symbiotic relationship between luxury and NFTs. I'm going to be sharing how luxury legitimizes NFTs, but how NFTs solve a lot of the challenges and allow for new opportunities for the luxury market. Now, first off, to begin this discussion, we must say, well, what is luxury? People say that it's rare, something's exclusive, prestigious, authentic, high levels of symbolic and emotional economic value, and a lot through customer experience. And often it's associated with something that's not essential. Although obviously artists would differ, but so the roots of really luxury, I'll say, is in art. Because that in many ways is probably the quintessential non-essential in the physical sense of the word. So when you talk about art, you talk about this notion of provenance and authentication. And as I said, what we saw before my $5 million painting here, it's the authentic one that made it worth so much more than the copy. But I say it's imperfect science. Why is that? So in 2012, I had the privilege of putting together some art collections that were on, that we auctioned through Christie's and Sotheby's. And one of the pieces that I put together in the auction was actually something, it was from a pretty well-known Chinese painter named Chang, who was a friend of my grandparents. And he was over their house one weekend, and he did work on a painting. And if you'll notice this painting, it's quite interesting. You'll see there's a mistake. This lady actually has two right hands. If you look at the left hand, you see that the thumb is in the wrong direction, right? So it's actually two right hands, when it should be the left hand. And so the painter, after he worked on it, kind of saw his mistake, and he left this painting at my grandparents and said essentially like, well, just didn't take it. It's kind of like put it in the garbage because I made a mistake. So my grandparents didn't throw it away. And so I thought, hey, this is pretty good. So what was it that we were able to get this authenticated and sell it in the 6 figures or that? And so what we had here was basically I had this thing, and I was working with the auction houses, and they're like, so how'd you get this? And so I had to really just like kind of asking people kind of come up with how the artist happened to be at my grandparents' place a certain weekend. And it was really, asking parents and hearsay, and my grandparents weren't around at the time, but there was really no perfection to that. So to show where this leads, this is a very famous case of a Picasso forgery in the LA area, and it was Femme au Chapeau Bleu, and it was sold as part of the Malcolm Forbes estate. And so the word, just with the Forbes estate, etc., sold for about $2 million. But in actuality, just years before, the dealer had hired someone to paint it for $1,000, and it was later discovered to be a forgery. So this word provenance, which comes from French words, where did it come from? And it's really about the journey of a piece of art. A lot of times on Chinese scrolls or paintings, when it passes through, someone puts their chop on it. And oftentimes they might write notes and then chop it, like the emperors that do that, to say this like kind of shows the history of something. So it's very important, the provenance, to determining the value of painting, because that and because that kind of makes it help as part of the authentication process, if you will. I was involved in putting together an auction of some ivory pieces, and when they were asking me sort of, well, what is the provenance? How did that come into your possession? I, very quickly went to go look up and confirm what I thought, that for those of you know, any ivory that's imported in the US before 1989 or after 1989 is illegal, right? So you can be sure that the ivory pieces that we put in the collection came into the US well before that time. And otherwise the auction houses can't be sold on the market. So when you can get this right, you can, this is one of the Picasso's that found Bonger. That was one of the highest pieces in auction at the time at $179 million. And you take pieces like the Mona Lisa, which have been authenticated and can't even be sold on the market because they're considered like national treasures. And with art, people come from all over the world to line up to see it, because this is that unique piece. And there are special spaces created to look at this. So now luxury brands, another form of luxury, they look to the art a lot to essentially, I call it making the essential non-essential. What is it that you can take a timepiece like a watch? What makes it either a $10 timepiece, become $100,000, $1 million timepiece. I mean, there was actually a very interesting story. I was actually with a Swiss watchmaker, and he didn't understand how watches could be sold for $10 in the streets of China. So to humor him, we went out and we got some watches, and he took it apart, could not believe the quality of what he saw, and actually changed some of the processes. But what is it that indeed one can command different values in the market? So always, we work with different artists. This is a Japanese artist to come up with this, and this makes a handbag maybe costs of production, I mean, just the raw leather in the, let's say, hundreds, if you will, to allow a bag like that to go for about 10,000 retail, or the Hermes Birkin bag, which was the highest bag ever at auction at $300,000. What is it about this notion of uniqueness or exoticness? One of the pieces that we were working with, for example, we had a mink that was we put in an oxygen tank without oxygen chamber, and we coated it with like gold paint, and you can imagine trying to train our sales force to be selling such a piece like that, when for them it was really very non-essential, if you will. So further, the brands go even further and go right into the art world itself. And this is one exhibit we worked on with the National Gallery, and we did this hot air balloon thing, which is the notion of taking you to iconic places that touch this brand throughout from that 1854 to the present 2011, and things that the people and symbols that it was. And here is Christian Dior. We worked with the Women's Contemporary Gallery, and we worked with 20 contemporary artists from China, and we sort of said, what is your interpretation of Dior? And all of this goes back to the point of luxury brands. They are looking for, how can you take the ordinary and make it extraordinary? How can you take the bag, the watch, the wallets, which have utilitarian uses, and make it that special thing? So we look a lot to the art world for this. And this is just different interpretation of dresses. And if you will, the brands have been able to turn their stores into what like a museum is. So this is a typical line you'll see outside of Chanel. So Chanel purposefully opens its store doors oftentimes like half an hour or an hour after the other stores, so that you kind of get this line phenomenon or different things. So it's very thought out in terms of how to create that feel. So now let's talk about where the NFTs come in here. So there's so many experts in this room here, but just for some of the key characteristics we'll be looking at is this notion that it's unique, not interchangeable, and you can trace the ownership on unique items. And I'll say items because it's not necessarily just a physical thing. It could be an experience, it could be, properties, different things. And usually the notion is that there's only like one owner at a time, and you can't modify that. And that, if you will, addresses many of these issues we were just talking about in terms of what the luxury good companies are looking, or luxury companies are looking at. So they want something that's rare, exclusive, and prestigious, right? So you have a unique fingerprint to this NFT. And one of the challenges in creating a product is it's finite. So when let's say you sell someone a purse, you don't go into their house 2 years later and say, okay, I want that purse back, right? It's the time is kind of one or zero, right? Whereas now with NFTs, you can limit the duration. So the whole product that you're offering can completely change. The authentication, it's unique and immutable there. And then the provenance, with the transactions being recorded, you don't have to be guessing and putting together all the pieces of, let's see, who had this before, because a lot of pieces of value come from who owned it before. So with this being ability to be able to track, it solves a lot of that. And now, because you can track it, put things where there's royalties to artists, it's very easy to do that. So you're seeing a big place in music with this. Now, next, connection with the community fan base, that is so much of what makes brands. So, you know, I lived in China for 11 years. I was the first person from headquarters to go into China because many years ago, people thought I was crazy when I said the Chinese is going to be one of the next big consumers. And a lot of people didn't believe me. And so I became the first one from headquarters to go into China and to break us into the market for the Chinese consumer around the world. And so much was about, okay, understanding what did the fans want. And we had, clients that, for example, wanted to have every pair of LV shoes, or somebody I was translating for someone about some bags on a wall, and I said, okay, well, which one do you like? After I explained the difference, she said, I'll take the whole wall. I want everything. And they want to collect it. They couldn't possibly even use or wear all these things, but it's just such a thing about the community fan base here. So with NFTs, it allows new fan bases because it's a different fan base typically. And modes of interaction with them. And then we won't have time to go into tonight, but there are huge supply chain issues in the luxury good market, because if it's unique, and for example, let's say, so I spend a lot of time in the duty-free space, so there are very strict rules about, you know, where something can touch in duty-free. So the question would be, if someone buys it, can I get it to them, you know, before they get on the plane, like if they're here versus there, and all the logistical issues. So NFTs, because they're so easy, you know, quick, right? If you will, it crosses borders and different things. And you can imagine like another issue, let's say with watches, luxury watches, when one of the biggest issues we had in terms of, let's say the Chinese community buying watches was when there was a problem, they didn't trust that when they sent the watch back, that it wouldn't get swapped on them. So we had to set up a whole center of Swiss watchmakers that we brought in to say, okay, you can either physically join the piece or be in country where we will be, you know, making sure that we give supply after. So I just want to share the NFT market has been crazy in 2021. I just want to share for some of you a bit about it and sort of give us thoughts about where it might be going. So this is the first 5,000 days, every day, first 5,000 days. And so for those of you who don't know, this artist every day did a piece of art, started with drawing and later on became more digital, and put this together. And why this is historically significant, it was the first time it's ever been all digital art for Prestige, and it was the highest price ever paid for a winning online bid for them. And now this one, the crypto pump. So this person who bought it paid $11.8 million for it. And he said he bought it because he liked the fact that it had a mask. It's the only pump that had a mask on. So a mark that was crypto during this time. Because a lot of it is all about, as you heard from the beginning, what is the story behind this and what makes this interesting. And this piece was, well, this guy has 3 accessories, the shades, the hat, and the pipe. I like that. So I'm going to pay $7.5 million for that. They all the eggs, right? And these are just computer generated, and it's so you have what? So what this was interesting was that this came with when you owned it, right? You get some of these like all these bonuses. You get bonuses like merch drops or different access to a graffiti board game.
And access to other NFTs that sit on top of that.
Exactly right. So and then well, I don't know why the video thing's not working, but you know people's foster money. So this one actually now it doesn't really need anyone after its last sale, but like this one went up 10 times in the aftermarket in just 4 months here. And this one, so now this, what I thought was really interesting about what we're seeing in this space is that this one, all the profits were used to go for a climate change nonprofit here. And then when the NBA Top Shot website came up of the NFTs, I think that was the first time you really saw a big brand name franchise putting a stamp on NFTs. So when in the beginning, when I was saying that the brand's luxury has validated NFTs, I would say the NBA franchise really is what kind of started this. And then we're seeing LV going into games there, and they're working with people. So once again, there's this collaboration with the artists. We have Burberry, and you too can buy your for your avatar, your little shoes, your fin, or your arm cuff there. And so the question I often get asked, is it worth it? And I think the only response to that is to ask yourself, is it worth it? Like, does that for some people has huge value? But we should ask some of the owners or something. And what I really like about, and I'm just going to end here with Dolce & Gabbana. What I really like, so they have right now an auction going on still of about 9 pieces, 9 NFTs. What's really interesting about this, I think, is they're challenging the what the NFTs are linked to. So this notion a lot of the digi and the physics space. So not only, let's say if you were to buy this dress, you get the animation, the rendering of the dress. You are allowed to go in, I think you have up to a year to go get a dress made for yourself. And you get the sketch, and then you can, for a certain period, go to certain stores and do a 2-week exhibition of your NFT. Now, I've yet to quite understand if you wanted to trade it, how many could you up that dress again, or if it's kind of huge, but how would that change? But I don't know if anyone has kind of that response. But what I think is fascinating is how now not only have NFTs been able to address the challenges of a lot of the luxury brands, but they've also been able to add on new things. They can now limit, this NFT lasts for 2 years. They can limit the time. They're interacting with a new fan base. Now, what's been fascinating is that Louis Vuitton has been going through a different fan base than its typical client base, whereas Dolce & Gabbana had limited who can actually vote, or bid rather, on the NFTs, and they're trying to stay at their kind of more sophisticated, older fan base there. And with that, I will let you, I know I'm standing right between you and the buffet, but I hope this kind of opened your mind up about some of the creative things that one can do with NFTs.
Great.
I truly appreciate all for you for coming. I hope this is a great experience for you guys. I know it's not easy to all meet up in person again. I truly appreciate all of you for coming. And if you like this event, open your phone, mark your calendar. The next event will be October 29, 5 p.m. here. And thanks to CK, our next keynote speaker will be Morgan Bell.
Oh, no.
You want to tell us more about who is Morgan?
Morgan, she's now a general partner at NFX. I worked with her this summer. She was one of the founders of Libra basically before she moved into the VC world.
Yeah. Anybody heard of Libra? You want to find out more about the founding story, how the Libra thing gets started?
Facebook project?
Yes, Libra. Yeah.